Thank you for the opportunity to be with you, and thank you for coming out. We're going to be looking at the third in our series of 8 lectures on God and government, and tonight we'll be dealing with the subject of crime and punishment. And follow along in the lecture outlines if you'd like to. The first point I'd make is that among conservative Bible-believing Christians, we tend to fall into 2 extremes on this subject of crime and punishment. The one extreme, the law and order extreme, is lock everybody up and throw away the key and enforce every punishment to the maximum. And defense attorneys, all they do is just try to lie and get witnesses to lie and confuse the system because every one of them is guilty. That's one view. And a lot of Christians tend toward that viewpoint. The other viewpoint is, no, forgive them all and let them all go free. After all, Christ died on the cross to pay for all our sins, so why do we need jails and punishment anymore? That's all taken care of on the cross. I'll suggest to you tonight that an appropriate biblical view of crime and punishment is going to be somewhere in between. So let's look at a few basic principles here. First of these is that the root cause of crime is sin. And we can clearly see that from the book of James, where James tells us, "From whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence even of your own lusts that war in your members? Ye lust and have not. Ye kill and desire to have and cannot obtain. Ye fight in war, yet ye have not, because ye ask not." Again, the idea is that crime comes from the fact of sin, and sin comes from the sinful nature that we have within us. Sin, death, and the devil, yes, he inspires it. Our sin nature pretty well entraps us into it, but nevertheless, sin is a choice that we make, and crime is one aspect of that sin. Likewise, as we would see in Galatians chapter 5, verses 19 through 21, "Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings, and such like, of the which I tell you before, as I have told you in the past, that they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God." Both of these are telling us that sin comes from within us. And that's contrary to probably the basic nature ever since sin came into the world. You recall that when Eve was asked whether she'd sinned, she tried to blame it on the serpent, and Adam blamed it on Eve. I'm not sure who the serpent tried to blame it on, a worm maybe, but point of the matter is, the idea of trying to escape responsibility for our sin, and likewise for crime, is probably a pretty universal tendency of man. Sometimes we say it's genetics. Heredity made me this way, that I've inherited this XY chromosome that makes me more susceptible to violence, or makes me more inclined toward addiction to drugs and so on. And it's that chromosome that has made me be the way I am. Or that seemed to be, for the last several decades, something that people really like to emphasize, that it was something in the genetics. Before that, it was usually environment. No matter what you did wrong, whether it was overtime parking or chainsaw murder, it was because of your environment. Something in your environment caused you to go astray. And anyway, so either way, it can't be my fault. Think about the kid one time who came back with a straight F's report card, and father really reprimanded him for this, and he said, "Well, Dad, what do you think the cause of this is, heredity or environment?" In other words, it's not me. Poverty. Poverty is what causes crime, except that we have more poverty today, or there's more crime today than we did in the darkest days of the Depression, and much more than in some of the most impoverished nations on the face of the earth. Illiteracy. Horace Mann once said that if we can expand the public school to cover the whole nation, poverty, crime, all these things will virtually disappear. Well, how's that working out for you? It has not been working out very well at all. That's at the very most a contributing factor, but not a cause. And then, of course, tendency on the part of the left is to blame firearms. And yet, sometimes we just have to say that the best way to deal with a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. That I would argue that firearms probably prevent more crimes than they cause. People kill people, not guns. And if guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns. That's not the solution. So how do we deal with the factor of crime as we see it in the Bible? Well, let's begin by looking at Romans 12. In Romans 12, verse 17, we read, "Recompense to no man evil for evil, provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." This is telling us that God has the authority to punish sin, and God has the authority to punish one aspect of sin that we call crime. We don't have that authority. That's God's responsibility. But there he is speaking to individual believers. Now, if we look over to chapter 13, there we read something different. There we read, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger, to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore you must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake." So what are we seeing here? It almost seems like a contradiction between Romans 12 and Romans 13. The answer is that God has all authority to punish crime, but he has delegated a portion of that authority to civil government. He hasn't delegated to each of us as individual citizens, but he has delegated that authority to the civil government. And so government has limited authority to punish crime. But before we punish crime, we need to make sure that we are punishing the right person. Biblical jurisprudence respects human dignity and requires precautions to protect the innocent. The Bible tells us that we are created in God's image. And being created in God's image means a couple of things. First of all, it means that we are responsible for our actions. We have the power of reason, and therefore we can be held accountable for what we do. But at the same time, being created in the image of God also means that there is a certain human dignity that affords to each one of us. And that being the case, we should not punish somebody unless that person really is deserving of punishment. And so that's why we have a system of criminal justice. First of all, to make sure who is guilty and who is not. And second, to make sure that those who are punished receive the proper punishment for their offenses. As we go back to Israel, we see that a system of judges is established in Israel. And you recall that Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, suggested this system to him, suggested that you can't judge all these cases by yourself, Moses. Rather, you need to set up a system of decentralized judges, have some justices of the peace over every 10 families, and then municipal judges over every 50, and county judges over every 100, and appellate judges over every 1,000, and so on. And you be the Supreme Court to hear the more difficult cases that can't be decided at the lower level. So a system of judges is established, a system that is to make sure that we hold trials and that people are not punished unless they are guilty, but that if they are guilty, we do make sure that they do, in fact, receive punishment. And a second thing that is commanded of these judges is that they are to be honest. As you look to the qualifications of judges, as Jethro suggests it to Moses there in Exodus 18, they are, first of all, to be graduates of ABA-approved law school. No, it doesn't say that at all. It says they are to be able men, but they are to be God-fearing, men who will not judge for bribes. In other words, character is the main thing that the Scriptures command that we look for in one who is to judge between men as to who is guilty of an offense and who is not. And then judges are commanded here and commanded throughout the Scriptures that they are to be honest and fair in judging people. Exodus 23, starting with verse 1, "Thou shalt not raise a false report, put not thine hand unto the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil, neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment. Neither shalt thou countenance a poor man in his cause. If thou meet thine enemy's ox or his ass going astray, thou shalt surely bring it back to him again," and so on. And throughout this, the command that judges are to be honest, they're to be impartial. First of all, obviously, they're not to show partiality to the rich, but we see here in verse 3 also, they're not to be partial to the poor. In other words, somebody is not going to get a special break in the courts just because he's poor. And judges could err in either direction there, but judges are commanded to dispense equal and fair justice. And then there are procedures that are set forth to make sure that someone is not convicted of a crime that he did not commit. First of all, the requirement of 2 to 3 witnesses. We see this in Deuteronomy 17:6, likewise 19:15, and Numbers 35:30, repeated in the New Testament. But in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let everything be established. In other words, there is to be corroboration. That is, rather than just relying on one person, because one person could be lying or could be mistaken, that has to be corroborated. There has to be some proof that that person is telling the truth. Now, 2 people could also lie. 2 people could also be mistaken, but it's less likely. And the system of justice, as we see it, whenever it's going to be administered by sinful people, is not going to be perfect. But at least we're trying to reduce the possibility of error to the minimum possible. Question that I've heard discussed occasionally as people look to this passage is the requirement here that testimony be corroborated, which meant you had to have somebody that would be a backup witness to confirm that what you said was correct. Could it be corroborated today by other means? For example, by fingerprints, or by polygraph, or by DNA, or hair samples and the like? Would this be sufficient to satisfy the corroboration requirement here, or should we take this literally to say it has to actually be 2 or 3 witnesses? Well, I'll let you consider that, and I'm not sure I would have the final answer on that question either. And then we have to make sure that witnesses are telling the truth. And so testimony is under oath. And if a witness commits perjury, perjury today almost seems like it's just a petty offense, but in those days, perjury was considered a very serious offense. In fact, the punishment for perjury in a criminal case was whatever punishment the defendant would have received if he had been found guilty. If it's a capital case, then the punishment for perjury in a capital case is the death penalty. Why do we have these requirements? Simply because the purpose of the legal system is to do justice. And what is justice? Well, I've seen a number of definitions of it, but Aristotle's definition might be as good as any, that justice is rendering to each person what is due. How do we determine what is due to a person? If I'm a judge and I have a defendant before me, should I have him executed or jailed or fined or set free or rewarded? In order to know the answer to that, I have to know the truth. Did he commit the crime or didn't he? And if he did, are there some aggravating or mitigating circumstances that should be considered in determining what the punishment ought to be? So those are the questions that we're dealing with here. We are trying to make sure that we get at the truth, because you cannot do justice apart from knowing the truth. Other precautions in the Talmud and extra biblical sources, for example, there had to be a quorum for the Sanhedrin. If Sanhedrin is trying a case, the verdict had to be unanimous in a capital case, and there also have to be a second deliberation just to make sure that nobody had changed his mind in the meantime. In fact, some accounts even say that between the first and second deliberations, criers would be walking the streets and shouting, "Jethro has been convicted of the crime of murder and has been sentenced to death. If anyone has evidence that would clear him, let him come forward now." Again, the important thing is to make sure that the guilty are identified and punished, and make sure that the innocent are in fact exonerated and set free. But once a defendant has been found guilty, and once the appellate process has been exhausted, then punishment is in order. And the basic principle of punishment is what we call the lex talionis, or the law of like punishment. Let the punishment fit the crime. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, and so on. And the most common form of punishment was usually restitution, to pay the person for his damages. In fact, that's the way many interpret the whole lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and so on. The picture you might get there is that if the defendant did something that maybe cut off the victim's hand, he's found guilty. Okay, Mr. Defendant, you cut off the victim's hand. Now you go back to the back room there and you see this guy back there that he has this sword and he has this fire before him. You stretch out your hand, he's going to cut it off. There you go. And Mr. Victim, here is the defendant's hand. You take that home and mount it on your fireplace for satisfaction. That doesn't accomplish a whole lot, though, does it? So probably what they did was they'd be asking the defendant, or the victim, okay, how much was that hand worth? Well, it was worth quite a bit. You see, Your Honor, I was a receiver for the Jerusalem football team, and now I can't catch passes with one hand, so instead of playing pro football, now I have to go out and glean in the fields, and even that's difficult because I have to hold the bag in my teeth and then glean with one hand, and it's a lot harder. I figure I'm gleaning maybe 50% fewer bushels than I was before this happened. Okay, 50 bushels a day, or however many bushels per day, Mr. Defendant, for this period of time, that's what you owe the victim. And if you can't pay it, you are going to be his bondservant until it is paid off or until the next year of Jubilee. That's the way punishments generally seem to have been administered, which really makes a lot more sense than an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. I mentioned once before that sometimes in pagan religions, we do see a few echoes of Eden, things of the law of God written on men's hearts that have perhaps come down through the years. And Mahatma Gandhi of India said something in regard to that might be worth thinking about at least. And he said, an eye for an eye, and pretty soon the whole world goes blind. Are we really accomplishing anything by it? But there were punishments. Sometimes punishment was scourging, and there was a limit in the Bible to 40 lashes, Deuteronomy 25:3. When we get to the New Testament, the limit in the New Testament is 40 lashes save one, or 39. Now, are we just getting a little soft in the New Testament? Or some say maybe that's just in case you miscounted. But another possibility is that usually the way they would do the lashes is with a scourge with 3 coils. Those coils would not just be leather, they would often have jagged pieces of metal or rock on them. But each time you struck the defendant with those 3 coils, that would count as 3. Now, 13 times 3 is 39, 14 times 3 is 42. And so that may be the reason. We're not clear. But at any rate, there is a limit, and it may be the reason is that once you start administering corporal punishment, that is physical torture, for too much, the result of that is that the victim starts to seem less than human. Maybe that's the reason. One thing that we see absent in the criminal justice system of the Hebrews and in the Old Testament law is prison. We don't see jails in Israel. We see prisons at various times from the Egyptians and the Romans and other foreign elements, but we don't see it in the Hebrew law. And you remember when they wanted to hold Jeremiah captive, they had to put him in a cistern. Apparently there weren't any jails to hold him, so they had to put him in a cistern. But the prison system has not really been a feature of the criminal justice system until the advent of the Quakers and in Pennsylvania in the 1700s. And the whole idea of penitentiaries, what is a penitentiary? It comes from penitent. The idea here is that in penitentiaries, you have people being penitent for their crimes. Well, again, I'm not sure how well that is working out. Many times prisons turn out to be simply training grounds for further crime. But in the early American system, in the colonies and so on, jails existed, but you weren't sentenced to confinement. Rather, jails existed primarily just to hold people pending their trial or pending execution. But as far as prison terms, you didn't see that. And today, we don't have physical torture, scourging or lashes or stocks or things like that. That would be considered cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. But sometimes I wonder, is that really more cruel than taking years out of a person's life in prison, where he's subject to all sorts of degradation and sexual assault and many other things like this, where he simply becomes embittered and prepared for further crimes, and where his family probably suffers at least as much as he does? Is that really the way punishments should be administered? Or were those who talked about lashes, were they actually being more humane than those of us with our prison system today? Well, it's just something I'm going to throw out for people to think about here. We do see capital punishment in the Scriptures. We see it authorized in the Noachic covenant, the covenant God made with Noah, Genesis 9:6. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Why? Because human life is cheap? No. For in the image of God made he man. In other words, we punish criminals with the death penalty for murder because human life is so precious that the taking of human life needs that severe punishment. So it's authorized in the Noachic covenant for murder. It's also authorized in the Mosaic law for various other offenses as well. How that applies today, I've known some who would say that it shouldn't really apply today except for murder because we are under the Noachic covenant, but not under the Mosaic covenant, and we can debate that either way. But others will say it's not authorized for the church age because Christ paid for our sins on the cross. Well, certainly he did. But if that was the case, we'd probably have to say that there shouldn't be any punishment at all, not just there shouldn't be murder or capital punishment for murder. But also, we look to Romans 13, verse 4, which we talked about before, and Paul is writing these words somewhere around probably 56 AD, but definitely in the church age. And here he says of the civil ruler, he bears not the sword in vain, for he is God's minister to execute wrath upon him that does evil. The sword that he speaks about there is the sword of capital punishment. And so it would appear to me that capital punishment is still authorized in the church age. However, it might be argued that we apply it differently in the church age. Augustine had an interesting exchange with a Christian judge, a judge by the name of Macedonius. And to look through their correspondence between Macedonius and Augustine, Macedonius seems to be saying to Augustine, "Why are you Christian bishops always seeking clemency for these criminals? You're putting Christianity on the side of crime and sin. You're making a disgrace out of Christianity." And Augustine basically responds that, well, we hate the sin, but love the sinner. That's not his exact words, but that's sort of what he is saying. Rather, he says, this is your model. It may be that this criminal has the potential to be reformed. If he is unbaptized, it may be that he will come to accept the forgiveness of sins if he is baptized, and he may do penance and offer his body for Christ. There are many routes to salvation, but the reason our predecessors preferred to err on the side of permissiveness to judges is that their sword should command terror, so that criminal madness should be suppressed, not encouraged. If they, that is judges, were refused communion, it would look as if punishing criminals were itself to be punished. They came to the view that it should lie with the magistrate's free exercise of restraint, not be a matter of legal requirement. What he is saying here is that in the Old Testament, the death penalty appears to be a mandatory requirement. In the New Testament, it's more like it's an authorized maximum, where if the judge thinks it's appropriate, he can order less than the maximum, especially if the defendant appears to be penitent. And anyway, so interesting, we see an exchange like that early in the history of the church. As we see the criminal justice system practiced in early America, I find it interesting the way the church would take a role in it sometimes as well as the state. And we think of New England as the place where you would have the strict biblical punishments being followed, but we do see this in the other colonies as well. Here is a case in Norfolk County in Virginia, case of a lady who has slandered a neighbor, and she has been ordered to ask forgiveness in the church, and she's refused to do so. So she's ordered to appear in court on a contempt charge, and she doesn't appear in court either. So here is the order that the judge gives. The sheriff shall take her to the house of a commissioner, and there she shall receive 20 lashes. She is then to be taken to church the next Sabbath to make confession according to the former order of the court. If she refuses, she is to be taken to a commissioner and to be given 30 lashes, and again given opportunity to do penance in the church. If she still refuses to obey the order of the court, she is then to receive 50 lashes. If she continues in her contempt, she is to receive 50 lashes and thereafter 50 every Monday until she performs her penance. Now, a lot of times the records in colonial courts are not complete, so what the final outcome of that was, we don't know. In New England, they were very specific in following biblical law. Many times their codes were drawn up based on Deuteronomy, and often drawn up by a minister, but preferably a minister who had also had some legal training. Interestingly, here's a case in Massachusetts that involved a couple that were found together in bed but not having sexual relations, and denied having sexual relations, and so the court had only suspicion of adultery, not the testimony of 2 witnesses required. Here's what they did. Whereupon, the case seeming doubtful to the jury, they judged it safe in the case of life to find as they did. So the court adjudged them to stand upon the ladder of the place of execution before the scaffold, with halters or nooses around their necks for 1 hour, and then to be whipped, and each of them to pay 20 pounds. But I suspect they might have thought of that very seriously the next time they were tempted to commit an offense. But why do we punish people? Why do we punish people for crimes? Let me suggest several reasons. And one is retribution. By retribution, we mean vengeance in a sense, and vengeance is not necessarily a bad word. But by retribution, we mean that if someone commits a crime and goes unpunished, it's kind of like the scales of justice have become unbalanced, and punishment is needed in order to do that balance. Some say that crime demands punishment. Immanuel Kant particularly would make that argument, that crime by its very nature demands punishment. Another is restraint. So long as somebody is in jail or executed and buried, they're not going to be committing other crimes. So the public is at least safe from people who are in jail. Other inmates aren't, and the guards may not be, but the public is at least safe while criminals are restrained in prison. A third reason is deterrence. And by deterrence, we mean, as we see when somebody is stoned in Israel, that all Israel may hear and fear. In other words, when we hear of a criminal being punished, that deters us from committing crimes. A fourth is rehabilitation, and sometimes that works. If we probably go about it in better ways, it could possibly work better. And interestingly, we've got programs that, like Chuck Colson, for example, with Prison Fellowship and other organizations that are similar to this, that are prison ministries that try to rehabilitate those in prison. And the rate of recidivism, that is those who commit crimes after they get out, of those who have been trained in some of these Christian rehabilitation programs like this, is much, much lower than for those who haven't had any or who've been through just the regular state rehabilitation systems. But anyway, so rehabilitation is one purpose, and then another is to prevent private vengeance. Now, what I mean by this is, I've seen this attributed to John Knox, but I've never been able to confirm that Knox actually said this. To the magistrate is committed the sword of justice, and if he fails to use it, others will. Meaning of this is that if government doesn't punish crime, people are going to take it into themselves in vigilante actions and the like. And we would see this under Viking law, as a matter of fact. Under Viking law, courts had the authority to adjudge someone guilty of a crime, but they didn't have the authority to administer punishments. And so what they would do is they would declare the person an outlaw, outside the protection of the law, meaning that the victim or the victim's relatives could do anything they want to punish him for. Sometimes outlawry might be for 3 years and so on. And so he's at their mercy now. The only thing is the defendant probably has some relatives too that don't agree with the verdict, and so they're going to stick up for him. And so we see blood feuds in Scandinavia that went on for generations at a time. Njal saga is one example of it, and many others, kind of like we have our own saga like that here, the Hatfields and the McCoys and so on. But if courts themselves don't administer punishment, people are going to feel like we have to do it, and they're going to take justice into their own hands. So those 5 reasons, retribution, restraint, deterrence, rehabilitation, preventing private vengeance, those are the reasons that we punish criminal offenses today. Well, I'm going to just close here by talking about a few areas of Christian concern. One of them is the tension between maintaining law and order and preserving civil liberties. The dilemma that we have here is, on the one hand, if we weight the system too strongly in favor of the civil liberties of the defendant, arguably a lot more guilty criminals are going to go free. On the other hand, if we weight it too much in favor of the prosecution, let's say if we changed the rule to say that a person is guilty until he can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he is innocent, if we weight things too much in favor of the prosecutor, then a lot of innocent people are going to be wrongly convicted and punished. How do we draw the proper balance? And that's what the courts are always trying to do. And that's where modern technology can come in fact, sometimes, as far as things that we've discovered now with forensic evidence, with hair samples, blood samples, and fingerprints, now DNA, and so on. And even DNA is not as infallible as we thought it was 30 years ago. But anyway, these may help to exonerate innocent persons and fix the blame on those who are truly guilty. So this problem may be resolving itself, but where do you draw the line? Blackstone used to say that it is better that 10 guilty criminals go free than that one innocent person be wrongly punished. Sometimes I would ask my class, do you agree? Well, I'll ask that here. Do you agree with that? How many agree? It's better that 10 guilty criminals go free than that one innocent person be wrongly punished. How many agree? Fair number of you do, okay. How about if 100 guilty criminals go free rather than one innocent person be punished? Would you still raise your hand? Or 1,000? Does it change the picture at all if we know that out of those 1,000 guilty criminals that go free, maybe 700 of them are going to go out and commit other crimes on other innocent persons? It's a dilemma. It's hard to say. In fact, I was told about a legal conference in China, and one man from England was there, and he quoted Blackstone's statement. It is better that 10 guilty people go free rather than one innocent person be wrongly punished. A Chinese law professor asked, better for whom? Fair question. But we see plea bargaining taking place like this way back there in the book of Genesis, where God is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham, my nephew Lot is there and his family. Can't do that. And so he starts kind of plea bargaining with God. What if I could find, I don't remember the numbers exactly, what if I could find 50 innocent people there? Would you spare the city if there are 50 innocent? Yes, I'll spare if there are 50. How about 40? Okay, 40. On down to 10. And they can't even find 10. But notice, God has a solution that is perfect. God's solution is to bring Lot and his family out of the city and then destroy the rest of the city so not one innocent person is destroyed and not one guilty person goes free. But that's part of the dilemma. Giving attention to the rights and the needs of victims and victims' families in these cases, they were oftentimes neglected in the legal system. All they were considered to be was at most just a witness in the case. Sometimes the victim would come up for the defendant's trial, find that the case had been dismissed and the victim hadn't even been told about it. But it seems like we have many more groups advocating the rights of victims, and the system itself is more concerned about victims than it used to be, and that's a good thing. Concern for prisoners and prisoners' families. They too are human beings. And in fact, the prisoners' families many times suffer as much as anybody does, and they too deserve consideration there. And then the fact of, as we sometimes say, justice delayed is justice denied. Ecclesiastes 8:11. Because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily. Therefore, the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. The longer you have between the crime and the punishment, the less people are to make that connection. Try punishing your dog for something he did yesterday. See how that works. Works a little better with people, but not necessarily that much. Point of the matter is, in all of this, our legal system is far from perfect. And I've talked about capital punishment. I personally believe that capital punishment is authorized for the church age. I also believe that capital punishment is somewhat, at least, of a deterrent to crime. And so I favor capital punishment, but I do have reservations about the way it is used. And one of the reasons is that when you see capital punishment in the Bible, the assumption is that you have a criminal justice system that is capable of determining guilt from innocence, not absolutely perfectly, but with good accuracy in that regard. I'm not sure our system is dedicated to do that today. Too often today we see that you get a conviction, a prosecutor will get a conviction by making a deal with one of the co-defendants that if you testify against your partner here, we'll drop these charges and give you only this one and give you this much off on this charge and so on. And the more juicy you can make your testimony, the better deal we'll give you. I really question sometimes how much our system today is dedicated to getting at the truth. Prosecutors today, and I've been a prosecutor, but prosecutors today oftentimes seem much more interested in building a record for themselves of getting convictions than they are of actually getting at the truth of the case itself. In fact, I've sometimes said that if you have any doubt of the doctrine of total depravity, be a prosecutor for a while. I served as a prosecutor for a year in Sioux City before I came into the Air Force. I'd grown up in Sioux City. I saw parts of Sioux City that I had no idea existed. But point of the matter is that we have a system that is stained by sin. And the best recommendation I can give for our system is that it's probably better than any other criminal justice system anywhere in the world. All that should drive us to the foot of the cross. So with that, do we have any questions before we close? Questions or comments?